So, how do we know what it means to be intellectual? We hear this word thrown around a lot, especially at university. And we know that we want to be intellectual, but what does that really mean? In order to understand what this term means, we also have to look at very similar terms of intellect and intelligence. Now, while these terms sound very similar, and in fact they share many same meanings, there are differences. So first off, the term intellect. And this means that something has the ability to reason. It is able to understand new ideas, and it's able to understand how ideas and things are related to one another or to each other. The term intelligence, or to be intelligent, are the characteristics of being able to learn from experience, to gain and to keep knowledge, to have an alert mind, and to be informed. So while intellect means that something can have the capacity, it has the ability to reason, intelligence is actually using that capacity and using that ability. Both intellect and intelligence also imply the ability of using reason to solve problems and to make sound decisions. So now that we know what both intellect and intelligence mean, what does it mean to be intellectual? Well, this term is used to characterize somebody who uses sound judgment and reasoning while trying to find knowledge. It implies greater powers of intellect as well as a greater ability to make intelligent decisions. Now, let's talk about standards. Standards is often synonymous with the term criteria, and standards are applied in order to measure things of the same class or type so as to find out their quality or their value. They're also used to judge or decide something, such as whether or not to accept or reject the quality of something. So, for example, a lot of times you might hear somebody say, the product was rejected because it did not meet the customer's standards. In essence, the customer expected the product to have some type of quality or some level of value, and he rejected the product because it didn't meet that measurement, that criteria. Now that we understand and have a common definition for both intellectual and for standards, let's put them together so that we can come to understand what we mean by intellectual standards. Intellectual standards are used to explain that there are different ways that we can measure whether somebody or something is using good judgment, whether it is or it has a rational understanding of the subject or the topic, and what the strengths and the weaknesses of somebody's thinking. We use these intellectual standards when analyzing how people answer questions, especially if they're attempting to answer questions of conflicting systems or of multiple systems. These standards allow everybody around us to measure the quality of arguments and the quality of thought using the same scale and using the same measurement criteria. Some of the common intellectual standards that we're going to be discussing in this class, both today and in lessons to come, include clarity, accuracy, precision, relevance, depth, breadth, logic, significance, and fairness. Let's first look at clarity. If something is clear, if it has clarity, it is free from confusion. It is understandable both by you and others around you, and is not ambiguous or obscure. If a statement is unclear, we cannot determine if it's accurate or relevant. In fact, we cannot determine what it means at all because we don't know what the person is talking about. So, for example, an unclear question might be, what can be done about the dog situation in Thailand? This question is very unclear because I don't know what the dog situation is. What is this person talking about? They may be talking about the dog population. They may be talking about stray dogs. They may be talking about dogs with diseases like rabies. You simply cannot determine what the person is talking about because the question is confusing and it doesn't provide us enough detail. A more clear question might be, what can be done about the situation of overweight dogs in Bangkok? Now I know what the person is asking of me. I understand the topic that the person wants to discuss. Next, we can look at accuracy. If something is accurate, it is free from errors or mistakes. It is true or correct. Now, accuracy is typically used with one system questions, things that we are able to research and find an absolute answer to. So, for example, a statement can be clear, I can understand it. It can be not confusing. However, at the same time, it can be inaccurate. So, for example, if I were to say most dogs weigh more than 150 kilograms, that's clear. I understand the statement. It's not ambiguous or obscure. However, it's also not factually correct. I could research and find the answer of the average weight of dogs. It might take some time, but I could find that answer somewhere. And I'm pretty sure the answer would be less than 150 kilograms. Now that we have looked at whether or not something is clear and whether or not it is accurate, we need to find out whether the information is precise. And when we look at precision, we are able to measure how specific a statement is. Now, this is important because something can be clear and accurate, but it doesn't give us enough specifics in order to tell us something that is useful. If I were to say the statement, my dog Fido is overweight, that wouldn't be very useful for you It's not exact, it's not precise, because my dog could be half a pound overweight or half a kilo overweight, or it could be 25 kilos overweight. When we give information like this, it's important to make sure that we are exact or we are as specific as possible. And this allows others to truly understand what we're talking about. Next, we can look at the relevance of a statement or the relevance of an argument. And what we mean by relevance is that the information is related to the matter at hand. It's related to the topic that somebody's talking about. Now, a statement can be clear and accurate and precise, but still not relevant. So, for example, if I were to say, Thailand should encourage people to become veterinarians, that's not very relevant to my dog Fido being overweight. Or it's also not very relevant to the topic of dogs being overweight. And this is because veterinarians, while they do look at the health of dogs, they generally cannot control whether or not a dog is fed or exercised properly. So that leads us to the irrelevant statement of Thailand should encourage people to become veterinarians. And finally, let's look at the depth of a situation. And while you might not know the word depth, you do know the word deep. And if something is deep in the ocean, it's not on the surface. And we want our statements and our arguments to be not on the surface of the subject. And what this means is that we want all of our arguments to contain many complexities. Complexities are a good thing. They show that we fully understand the subject. And when we have depth in our argument, when we have a deep level of understanding, it implies that we have been thinking about many things that affect the situation, that affect the context, that affect the idea or the questions that we're asking. So we need to make sure that we don't just think about things on the surface. We need to probe deep in order to discover how complex the issue is. So I'm going to give you two examples, two statements, two arguments about obesity and dogs in Bangkok. The first is a shallow example. It's just on the surface. A shallow example would be, people shouldn't feed their dogs too much. Well, yes, this is true, but it doesn't get to the deeper issue of how to keep our dogs fit and healthy. It's a very simplistic statement. A better example of depth, of looking at all the complexities of this issue, would be, in addition to not feeding dogs too much, people need to make sure that they also exercise. This can be difficult in a place like Bangkok, which doesn't have many dog parks. Now, that statement is much better than the previous one because it starts to look at the many different issues, the many complexities that face people who want to keep their dogs healthy in Bangkok. So not only should we make sure that we're feeding them correctly, but we need to make sure that they exercise correctly. And we start to look at the issue of where can a dog exercise in Bangkok? Well, this is difficult for people because, especially if you have a large dog, a dog that needs to run a lot, there aren't many places for dogs to do that. So, in conclusion, we looked at the first half of some common intellectual standards today. We got some definitions of what it means to be intellectual, what standards or criteria mean, and when we put the two terms together, what we should be aiming for in terms of intellectual standards. After discovering some common definitions for these terms, we looked at a couple different examples of intellectual standards that are very common. We looked at clarity and what it means to be clear. We looked at accuracy and what it means to be factual. We looked at precision and what it means to be specific or exact in our detail. We looked at relevance and what it means to be on topic and to be speaking about the same subject. And finally, we looked at the depth of an issue and what it means to be complex and not shallow with our arguments. In the future, we're going to look at 4 more intellectual standards, the standards of breadth, logic, and significance, and fairness. Well, I hope you enjoyed today's lesson on intellectual standards. Join me next time when we look at more complex intellectual standards.